So, Mike, we've winding down Ezekiel. We only have 2 more episodes. So, what are you going to do?
Can you believe it? Can we stretch it into 5 or 6?
Technically, yeah, it should be another 8 or 9. So, how are you going to do this?
Well, chapters 40 through 48. We're gonna do this in 2 parts, and we'll just jump in here. I mean, these chapters are divisible into 3 sections. So you have 3 whole chapters, basically 40 into 43, describing the vision of the future temple. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and just read through all that. Oh, well, this is what a corner means. This is what a measuring reed is. Okay, we don't need to do that. But again, it's important to say something about it, and we're going to do that in this episode. Then you get chapters 44 through 46. Those are rules governing going into the temple and coming back out. Okay, again, that's not terribly exciting, so that's not going to get its own episode. And then 47 and 48, you have the allotment or the apportionment of the future land among the people of Israel. Okay, so that has sort of this Joshua feel to it. But again, none of this material is really going to lend itself to something super revelatory at the granular level. Okay, and that's the key thought here. If you take these chapters as a whole, there are some things that are not only worth thinking about, but that are really important to think about when it comes to, okay, what does this mean? Not only, again, for its original hearers, but something toward the future, something beyond Ezekiel's own day. And of course, right away, there's the big issue of, should we understand this description literally? Is this like going to be a temple in the future millennial kingdom, and all these sorts of questions? So on a macro level, taking these chapters as a whole, there's a lot of interesting stuff here that needs to get talked about. And so that's how we're going to approach it. Now, if you're interested, I'm going to send Trey a diagram, basically pictures that come from Block's nasi៍commentary on Ezekiel, the 2nd volume, of what the structure would look like, that sort of thing. So you'll be able to look at that, but we're not going to go to the granular level here and talk about, well, hey, look, how is this vestibule different from the other one over here? We're not going to do that. But if you want to know, again, a sort of a visualization of this content, we'll make that available. Today, we're really going to talk about 2 issues related to Ezekiel 40 through 48. The first one is the question of whether we are to understand this vision as a future literal building. In other words, this idea of a temple in the millennial period being a physical structure that is built either before or in conjunction with the second coming of Christ. In other words, is this about a building that's going to be in operation after the second coming? Okay, that's one issue. The second is the matter of the nasi៍, which is a Hebrew term for prince in these chapters. Now, the first part, people, the quote prophecy experts, unquote, they're all over the whole building thing, for right or wrong. The talk about the prince, though, I think gets neglected and is going to influence, I think, ultimately the way we need to look at these chapters. So we're going to discuss those 2 matters as they pertain to this whole collective Ezekiel 40 through 48. So let's start with the first issue. Are we to understand this vision of Ezekiel as a future literal building, i.e., a temple, another temple that is in operation after the second coming of Christ? Now, I'm predisposed to answer this question, no. It's not about a literal building for 3 broad reasons. And here they are. We're gonna drill down into all of these things, but here are my 3 reasons in a nutshell. Number 1, about my view that the future earthly kingdom is the new earth, not a 1,000-year interregnum before the new earth. We talked about that in the last podcast that we did on Ezekiel 38 and 39. So when people ask me if I believe in a coming earthly kingdom of God with the returned Messiah, Jesus, as its king, my answer is yes. I believe the kingdom will come to earth. But I don't mean the standard millennium idea when I say that. So, it's this length issue. It's this number issue. But again, if that's unfamiliar to you, listen to the last podcast, part 2 of Ezekiel 38 and 39, and you'll understand what I'm talking about there and why. Secondly, I think we have to say that this isn't about a future literal building because of the negative arguments against literalism here. That is, features of the text that suggest that what's being described transcends literalism. In other words, there are textual indications that don't seem to jive with literal expectation that Ezekiel 40 through 48 is really about giving instructions for building this temple that's in operation after the second coming. Thirdly, there are positive arguments for seeing the description in Ezekiel 40 through 48 as pointing to a reality that transcends a physical building. So there are arguments against it from the text, and there are arguments against a literal approach in the text, and there are arguments for a more than literal approach. Now, the third one of those, the positive arguments about seeing the description as pointing to some reality that transcends a physical building, that's really going to be where we land in part 2. Okay, so next episode, part 2 of Ezekiel 40 through 48, we're going to really focus on that third element, the positive arguments for seeing the description as something that transcends the idea of a literal building. So for today, again, we're going to park in the other things. So let's focus on my second reason. We're not going to go back and talk about Ezekiel 30 and 38 and all that sort of stuff about new earth is the kingdom and as opposed to a 1,000-year millennial reign, how to 6 of one and half does another. We're not going to go repeat that. So what we're really going to focus on here are the negative arguments that arise from the text against taking this description as a building project in the future, about building a structure in the future. So within that category, again, negative arguments, let's just list out a few. I'll use letter numbers here because I use new numbers above. So the first one, letter A, if you're taking notes here, there are disconnections with other Old Testament passages about building the tabernacle and the temple in earlier contexts. There are disconnections with those descriptions and this one in Ezekiel 40 through 48. Now, in his article, there's an article by Moshe Greenberg entitled The Design and Themes of Israel's Program or Restoration. He notes the following. He talks about the fact that there are instructions for making the desert tabernacle in Exodus 25 through 30. There's a narrative describing its building, the actual building of that structure in Exodus 35 through 40. There's also a narrative description of the building of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 6. None of these other passages that describe how to build and the building of these other structures, none of them are really similar to what we have in Ezekiel 40 through 42 when we actually get the description of the temple. In fact, Ezekiel 40 through 42 is actually not a set of instructions for building anything. It's a vision of something that's already built. Okay, that it's a vision of something that exists. There are no building instructions in Ezekiel 40 through 48, and specifically chapters 40 through 42. Taylor, who we've mentioned on other episodes of Ezekiel, this is not from his commentary. This is from an essay called "The Temple in Ezekiel" in a book called "Heaven on Earth," just about temple stuff, tabernacle stuff throughout the Bible. He writes this: the first thing to note is that there is no indication in Ezekiel that the construction of such a city and such a temple was authorized by God. As Allen, another scholar, observes, significantly, there is no call to rebuild the temple, only to observe the regulations for rites and offerings. The new temple was to be Yahweh's creation, built for rather than by his people. It's a model of his own being and of his relationship with them, unquote. Back to Taylor. Instead, Ezekiel is presented with a scenario prepared by God, which he is shown around by his interpreting angel guide. The new temple is God's doing. The prophet's only task is to describe it in full detail as he can. In other words, there's no command in these chapters to build anything. The prophet just sees this thing that God says, hey, go look at that and then describe it. And he does. So that's a disconnect, because when you have the descriptions of the tabernacle and the temple in other parts of the Old Testament, there are very clear building plans there, very clear things that people are supposed to do to create this structure. You don't get that in Ezekiel 40 through 48. So that is it's a very obvious, at least to a close reader, it's a very obvious outlier. It's something that you'd expect that is missing. Secondly, or letter B, again, if you're taking notes, there are irregularities in the architecture and the furniture of what Ezekiel describes in chapters 40 through 48. Again, things that you'd expect to see, and they're either not there or there's something odd about them. First example, under, again, letter B, if you're taking notes. There's an absence, curiously enough, of height dimension in nearly all of the descriptions. In fact, height, again, the Hebrew term for height, is actually mentioned only 2 times. One is in Ezekiel 40, verse 5, where it alludes to a wall, and the other one is Ezekiel 43:13, where it describes the height of the altar. Now, Greenberg comments on this on page 193 of his article. He says, there are some notable omissions. With very few exceptions, measurements are of length and breadth only. In other words, the visionary has effectively conveyed only a ground plan, bounding and describing areas in accord with his basic concern over separation and gradation of sacred space, unquote. Now, at another point, Greenberg says this, a word on the precision and detail argument, again, is affected by this. Again, just to summarize, what Greenberg is thinking, how can you say something is really precise? In other words, how can you say God is giving a detailed plan that he wants people to follow to construct this building, this object, if he never throws in how high things are supposed to be, how tall things are supposed to be? What would you do? What would you do as a contractor? 2 out of 3 dimensions here are there, but the third one isn't, and it's kind of important. And not only that, but there's never any clear description of a roof, for the temple, which is really odd. I mean, I don't want to be, kind of silly about it, but we really don't want birds pooping on sacred space. I mean, this is why buildings have roofs, especially if they're holy buildings, and you just don't have this. Now, I think this is noteworthy because one of the things you run into all the time in defense of the this must be about a literal structure that's going to be rebuilt or built after or before, shortly before, whatever, sometime to be used by the Messiah after he returns, is this so-called detail argument. And I just want to throw in a few thoughts here, my own 2 cents here. I don't think the detail argument makes much sense just generally, and here's why. Think about the logic. The more detail something receives, that means we're supposed to take the passage literally. Well, if that's the case, what does that say about the meaning of prophecies that have less detail? Should we take them non-literally then? There are plenty of Old Testament prophecies about Messiah, again, that lack detail. And in some cases, they're kind of ambiguous. The fact that something is laid out in detail is not an argument against its symbolic meaning later on, either within the Old Testament or how the New Testament repurposes something. Just by way of illustration, Passover is laid out in great detail, actually 2 different chapters in the Old Testament, but it's considered a type. It's considered symbolic. It's a type of the sacrifice on the cross later on. And the crucifixion, when you read the crucifixion accounts, it doesn't mime the steps of the Passover. It doesn't do that at all. But there's a very secure relationship between the two. The equation is made by New Testament authors, nevertheless. So there you have a case where something's very detailed and you're not supposed to interpret it literally because the crucifixion doesn't mimic what happens in the Passover, even though there's a very clear conceptual relationship between the two. So you got, in essence, detail is not a hermeneutic. Detail, the fact that something is detailed, doesn't tell you how it should be interpreted. The fact that it's not detailed doesn't tell you how it should be interpreted. The issue is, again, context or contexts. And one of the contexts that's important that I think gets neglected is how the New Testament repurposes ideas. You know that if you listen to this podcast just in general, I'm kind of big on this notion that the New Testament is an inspired commentary on the Old Testament. So what the New Testament says about the Old Testament ought to matter. And I think this is a case too. Now, we're going to get into more of that in part 2, because the New Testament does have a lot of temple talk in it. And there is no prophecy in the New Testament, about the expectation that a new temple will be built. There just isn't. Amid all of its temple talk, okay, you're not going to find that. And of course, the defenders of a literal approach here would say, well, who cares? We have Ezekiel 40 through 48. Look at all that detail. Well, again, does that tell us how to interpret anything? And is it really that detailed? Because it doesn't have any height, doesn't have a roof. So what counts as detail? What counts as precision? And I hope you get the idea that there are disconnections here. Another one, again, this is all under, again, what would be our letter B. So we have these irregularities in architecture and the furniture. So the first one was the height dimension is not there. Second, there are some issues of disproportion and, again, omission as well. Greenberg says, he notes, the massive size of the gatehouses verges on caricature. Their dimensions, which are 25 by 50 cubits, exceed those of the main hall of the temple itself, 20 by 40 cubits. Their length is half that of the inner court, 100 cubits. In other words, if you actually built this, it's going to look kind of odd. It's going to be pretty disproportionate. He also notes that many furnishings of the Solomonic temple and the desert tabernacle are missing in this description. For example, the ark and its cherubs and the lamp are not there. The only interior furniture mentioned is an ambiguous, quote, altar of wood, unquote. Greenberg adds, it's very strange is the absence of a wall around the inner court, to which its 3 massive gates might stand in relation. No equivalent, in addition to the lavers or the bronze sea, appears in the outer court. Where were the priests supposed to wash? The notion that the water issuing from the temple might serve for that purpose is unlikely, for until it leaves the temple, it's too thin a stream for body washing. An end of quote for Greenberg. So again, he highlights some of these oddities. Important objects of furniture are missing. And of course, if you have a temple and your temple is in operation, then of course, we have the whole issue of sacrifices. Why would the sacrificial system come back? And again, I'll say something about that a little bit later. I don't think it makes any sense that it would come back. But let's just say, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Literalist, okay, it's a real building, and now we're going to have sacrifices again. What they don't tell you, they'll come up with all sorts of reasons why this makes sense even after the cross, that we have sacrifices again. But what they won't tell you is hey, there's no place for the priest to wash. And that's kind of important for Old Testament ritual. Hey, some of the objects that got sprinkled with blood, okay, in the Old Testament aren't even there. Oops. Again, they're just these disconnects. Again, these are disconnections that arise from the text. This isn't Mike saying, "Oh, I just don't like this view, so I'm not going to take it." No, these are problems present in the text, or in some cases they're not in the text. That those absences create problems for this perspective. Thirdly, again, under the same category here, there's an inconsistency with the boundaries of the promised land. Now, that's going to come later in chapters 47 through 48, as we mentioned at the beginning. The land here that's talked about in Ezekiel is kind of minimalist. In other words, it's the boundaries of the land that are linked to the conquest at a very specific time, under Moses, David, Moses, Joshua, and David. I mean, what about that extra stuff there? Probably saying it a better way. The boundaries here in Ezekiel 47 are roughly those found in the book of Numbers, chapter 34, verses 2 through 12. Again, that excludes, if you actually compare the boundaries here in Ezekiel 47, go back to Numbers 34, here's what's not in the description of the land. It excludes on the north part, again, I'm going to just use Greenberg's summary here, it excludes on the north the Aramean kingdoms conquered by David. Well, if David conquered those kingdoms, why shouldn't they be in the land, in the possession of the Israelites later on in this this eschatological scene? But it excludes what's conquered by David. On the east, it excludes the Transjordanian domains of the ancient tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half-tribe of Manasseh. On the south, it excludes the Edomite territory down to Ezion Geber, which was once part of the kingdom of Judah in the monarchy. So if you're going to interpret this literally, if you're going to interpret Ezekiel 40 through 48 literally, and, oh, this is about a literal building, well, again, look at what the proponents of this view are not telling you. They're not telling you the priests have no place to wash. They're not telling you that important items of furniture to the sacrificial system aren't there. They're not telling you that it doesn't have a height dimension, it doesn't have a roof, that there's disproportion even what is there. And they're also not telling you, hey, if you go actually look at the description of the land here, there's missing land. There's missing land from the monarchy. There's missing land from the days of Moses and Joshua that was conquered and claimed as part of the promised land. That it's missing. So how would we legitimize a literal reading of one part of Ezekiel 40 through 48 and kind of let these other ones slide? Okay, I'm suggesting to you that we really can't do that and be consistent. Number 4, again, under what would have been letter B, the irregularities, if you're taking notes, number 4 would be there's no clarity of any command for building anything. Here's the, I've already mentioned this, but we're putting it under here because I want to read a particular passage. Here's the closest you get to any sort of command about building something, and it really isn't a command to build anything, but the closest you get is Ezekiel 43 verses 10 through 12. I want to read those to you. God says, "As for you, son of man, describe to the house of Israel the temple, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and they shall measure the plan. And if they are ashamed of all that they have done, make known to them the design of the temple, its arrangements, its exits, and its entrances. That is, its whole design. And make known to them as well all its statutes and its whole design and all its all its laws, and write it down in their sight, so that they may observe all its laws and all its statutes and carry them out. This is the law of the temple. The whole territory on the top of the mountain all around shall be most holy. Behold, this is the law of the temple." Okay, that's the end of verses 10 through 12, Ezekiel 43. The only thing they're commanded to do here is observe the temple laws and its statutes and carry them out. They're never commanded to build anything. Again, if you can read through the entirety of these 8 chapters, and you will not find a command to build the thing. That is really odd, to say the least. Now, we've had again, I'm trying to keep a sense of an outline here because there's just a lot of detail here. Again, we're talking about negative arguments against the literalistic approach to this. A was disconnections with other Old Testament passages about tabernacle and temple building. B was irregularities in the architecture and the furniture. And so we had 4 things under that. And then C, we have an incoherence, just a general incoherence problem of the return to sacrifice. And I would say, and I'm going to explain what I mean here, even without the atonement issue. Now, those who think the Old Testament sacrifices about atonement mean atonement for sin. In other words, sort of the popular evangelical approach to the Old Testament sacrificial system. People think this is like about the getting moral forgiveness and having your sins wiped away as an individual, that sort of thing. In other words, they're superimposing the talk about Jesus onto the Old Testament sacrificial system. If you have listened to our series on Leviticus, you know that just doesn't work. That's not actually what Leviticus says, 99% of the time. The sacrifices are really about purifying objects and purifying sacred space and that sort of thing. But let's, for the sake of discussion, say that you're one of these people who takes the sacrifice language in the Old Testament as being about personal atonement for sin. Well, if you're taking that perspective, you've got a serious problem. It has to be correct that the sacrifices are not brought back for this purpose. If they are brought back to atone for personal sin, then I don't know any other way to put it, then the writer of Hebrews was just wrong. Because the book of Hebrews makes a big point about how the atoning work of Christ is the key for personal forgiveness, past, present, and future. Look, folks, you and I were born after the cross, okay? And the work of Christ is completely sufficient, completely adequate to take care of our sin problem. So why wouldn't it be completely adequate to take care of some future person's sin problem who's living during a millennium? Okay, if they need the sacrifices, if they need animal sacrifices, again, the writer of Hebrews and other passages in the New Testament are simply wrong. They are errant. That is a huge problem. It's a theological problem, to say the least. Now, many, in my experience, want to affirm a literal temple, but then when you point out the sacrifice problem, they say, okay, well, all right, the sacrifices aren't literal, but the temple still is. Well, let's think about that. If the sacrifices ought not to be considered as literal, why would somebody consider the temple being literal? Who needs a temple with no sacrifices? What's the point to having a temple? If Jesus' sacrifice covered us who lived well after the event, why wouldn't it cover other people who live later in a presumed millennial kingdom? In other words, why would people living in the millennium need animal sacrifice for atonement? Why? The cross atoned for the sins of the world, everyone who ever lived, past, present, and future. So it would naturally include them as well. So what do we need the system for? And if we don't need the system of sacrifices, why do we need a temple? What good is a temple without a sacrificial system? Now, most who would seek to defend sacrifices returning say they will be, some sort of memorial or teaching illustration. In other words, well, the sacrifices will come back to help people in the millennium understand what happened at the cross. Okay, let's think about that, because frankly, it's deeply flawed. Why would people need sacrifices as a reminder of the atonement of Jesus? Why not just hand them a New Testament and have them read about it? Why would anybody need sacrifices for understanding how Jesus fulfilled the point of Old Testament sacrificial stuff when they could just read it like you and I did in the New Testament? Where's the prophecy that says there won't be any New Testaments around in the millennium? Just hand the person a Bible, hand them a New Testament, say, well, here's what's going on here. There's the returned Christ, there's the returned Messiah. Hey, if you want to find out what he did in the past on the cross, here, read this chapter. Why do you need to bring the sacrifices back? Are there no Bibles anymore? Again, it just doesn't make any sense. And with respect to modern Jews, they haven't needed the Old Testament law, quote, commemorated, unquote, to become believers in the Messiah since the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago. Jews have come to Christ just fine for 2,000 years without needing to watch a sacrifice to learn what Jesus did. Again, the whole approach just doesn't make any sense. So I think we have a severe coherence problem. But now let's just say, again, we'll try to make it better here. Let's say, okay, you have someone who wants to defend, the literal approach, and they understand that the sacrifices in the Old Testament weren't about individual, sin, moral cleansing, like in other words, we can't impose the talk about Jesus on the Levitical system. And again, if you don't believe that, go listen to the series on Leviticus. Let's just say somebody realizes that, and they say, okay, the sacrifices that are going to come back in the millennium aren't about atoning for sin. They're purification offerings, okay? They're purification offerings. Well, again, we have an issue there. On the one hand, it's nice to know that you have somebody here who realizes that the Levitical sacrifices were about the purging, or the word we liked when we were doing Leviticus was they were about decontaminating sacred space and sacred objects. Okay, that's good. Okay, but now the point is, well, maybe this is what we're doing now. When the sacrifices come back, because we have a literal temple and the sacrifices come back, and there's no point to having a temple without sacrifices, but when they come back, it's not about personal atonement. People can get saved just like they do today. It's about cleansing sacred space. It's about keeping the temple, the new temple, this great millennial temple. It's about keeping that temple pure and decontaminating it, just like it was in Leviticus. Okay, well, I'll ask it again. If this is your vision, why do we need to revert to purifying sacred space in the millennium when we, as believers, are sacred space according to the New Testament? See, the New Testament describes believers as the temple. It describes believers as the temple because Jesus referred to his body as the temple, and we are the body of Christ. The New Testament says that the Spirit of God, the same glory of God of the Old Testament, quote, tabernacles within us. We are sacred space. This is why Paul in 2 Corinthians 6 would say things like, what fellowship does the temple of God have with idols? Don't you recognize that you're the temple of God? All this impurity, language, like in 2 Corinthians 6, okay? This is why the New Testament talks about us the way it does. We are sacred space. So if that's true in the New Testament era, and it is because that's what the New Testament says, why do we need to build a building and then regularly decontaminate it? Why do we need to do that? Again, I don't see the coherence and the consistency. Why would we revert to purifying sacred space on the ground in a building so that we can be in the presence of God when the presence of God, the Spirit of God, is in us? What? In the millennium, believers are no longer inhabited by the Spirit? Is that the point? Again, people rarely think about the ramifications of the literalist approach to this. And again, aren't there any Bibles in the millennium? Doesn't the Spirit of God reside inside believers, tabernacle within them in the millennium, making them sacred space? Why do we need this? These assumptions need to be evaluated. These questions need to be asked. Again, and I've asked them to myself a good amount, and which is why I gravitate away from looking at Ezekiel 40 through 48 as some sort of command or even vision of something that's going to have to be built later on. Now, the second issue, let's just transition away from that. Those are my arguments, my negative arguments against the literalistic approach. But our second issue for today concerns the matter of the nasiʼ, okay, the prince that is talked about in these chapters. Now, I could have included this as a problem for literalism as well, but I don't want to do that because this is less familiar, and we need to. It sort of needs to have its own space, its own time, its own dedicated treatment here. So that's the way we're going to handle it. And I associate it with literalism because you're going to see that if you take what's said about the prince too literally, you're actually going to have disconnections between that figure, that character, and Jesus, the returned Messiah. So it could be another one of those issues where, hey, who's the consistent literalist here? You know, if you want to take these chapters and talk about the temple, then you need to be consistent and look at the prince with the same commitment to literalism. If you do that, you're just going to run into problems. But that's not to say that he has no connection at all to Messiah, because there might be, there could be that sort of thing, maybe conceptually, maybe a little bit. But if you're really pressing the text for literalism, it's not good enough to have a little bit of a correlation between Jesus and the prince. You need all of it. Now, I realize that talk is probably unfamiliar totally, because most people, when they read these chapters, they are fixated only on the building description. They kind of gloss over this prince guy in these chapters, but we need to get into that. So the starting point for this is to note, first off, full disclosure here, because we're dealing with the text, that the word nasiʼ, prince, is of course not the same as the word for king, melech, but elsewhere in Ezekiel, those two terms appear synonymous. They do overlap. And for that reason, scholars fall into sort of two interpretive categories when it comes to this figure, the prince. Number one is that the nasiʼ, the prince, is also the king, Melech, and probably of the house of David. So there's one school of thought that says the prince is a Davidic king that gets referred to also as king and as prince here in these chapters, just like in Ezekiel 33 through 37, where there are passages where these two terms overlap. We should take that information, and when we read Ezekiel 40 through 48, we think to ourselves, even though he's only called prince here, nasiʼ, we're still talking about a Davidic king. So that's the first view. The second view is to say, well, the nasiʼ, the prince, is not a Davidic king. And he's not a Davidic king because at this point in Israel's history, they've sort of despaired of having the monarchy return. They've despaired of a messianic hope. Again, this is sort of a standard critical view. Or at least you don't have a king specifically in view here. That's not really a good argument because, again, I think it's sort of it's a little bit of an odd hermeneutic to say that the Jews have abandoned a messianic hope here, because you're going to have prophecy at the same time period outside of Ezekiel, and you're going to have prophecy after the time of Ezekiel that is clearly looking for a future messianic rule. So I think that's kind of an odd approach. I think better for the second view that we don't have a Davidic king here. We don't have a specific Messiah figure. I think better is to note that there are specific restrictions in these chapters placed on the nasiʼ that make his identification as the Messiah extremely unlikely, and some would say impossible. Okay? So those are the two views. One, take, who cares if he's the prince? He's called the prince. He's still the king because those two terms overlap. We have a messianic figure here. Okay, that's one view. The other view that I'll adopt for the sake of our episode is like, no, we can't really look at this nasiʼ figure as a prince, as the Messiah, because there's just too many restrictions placed on him that don't jive with Messiah in general, and frankly don't jive with Jesus. Okay? And I'm going to fall into the second view. I think you can already tell that. Now I'm going to quote at length here from an article by a scholar whose last name is Biggs. His first name escapes me right now. I think it's Robert, but I don't want to commit to that. And I will put this article in the folder, the protected folder, for those who subscribe to the newsletter, so you can read it if you want. But it's called "The Role of Nasiʼ in the Program of Restoration in Ezekiel 40 through 48." And Biggs writes this. I like this because frankly I could not improve on a better summary of this. And I'm really going to skip around a number of pages here and mash this together, different sections of his article. But it's a nice summary of what we're dealing with here. He writes, the term nasiʼ occurs 18 times in chapters 40 through 48, all in chapters 43 to 48, and is the only title used for the leader of the future restored community. Now catch that. It's the only title used for the leader of the future restored community in these chapters. Continuing, by way of comparison, Melech, king, occurs 3 times, all in the brief passage, Ezekiel 43, 6 through 9, and all referring to past kings of Judah. The references to nasiʼ in chapters 43 to 48 are concerned with the nasi''s relationship to the temple, or the distribution of the land. It may be that the latter use also has some connection with the temple. The first reference to the nasiʼ occurs in Ezekiel 44, verse 3. This verse prescribes that only the nasiʼ may sit in the east gate of the temple and eat bread before Yahweh. The east gate is permanently closed because the, quote, glory of Yahweh, unquote, has entered the temple through it. The nasiʼ is permitted to eat a sacrificial meal in the gate, and it thus becomes something of a cult room, as other scholars say. But the nasiʼ is not given any cult functions here or elsewhere. And I should stop here and say the term cult in scholarly lingo is to be equated with doing rituals. Okay, back to Biggs. The role of the nasiʼ in relation to the cult, again, the ritual character of the priesthood here, is taken up in chapters 45, 46. Okay, he has some verse citations there. Chapter 45, verses 13 through 15, describes the atonement offering to be made by the people. This offering is to be given to the nasiʼ. This gives the nasiʼ an important role in the cult. He is not directly involved in making the offerings and sacrifices, but he is responsible for providing the animals and grain so that offerings may be made for the house of Israel. As in chapter 44, verse 3, we see the nasiʼ closely related to the cultic activity, though not actually involved in it. However, in a real sense, responsibility for its proper functioning falls to him. Provision for the celebration of the Passover festival and the Feast of Ingathering are given in chapter 45. We notice that the provisions for the sacrifices are to be made by the nasiʼ, quote, for himself and for the people of the land. I note that, for himself and for the people of the land. That is, the nasiʼ is responsible for the effective functioning of these festivals. He is not directly involved in the actual sacrificial action, but he is to ensure that that action may take place. He is not a cultic official, but he supports the operation of the cult. The nasiʼ is of primary interest in chapter 46, 1 through 12, but he is considered in relation to the people when regulations for movement within the temple are given. Verses 1 through 8 deal with his honored position in the cultic celebration. He may stand at the threshold of the inner east gate when it is open for sacrifice on the Sabbaths and new moon celebrations. He is not permitted into the inner court itself, but at the entrance he may observe his sacrifices being offered. The position of the nasiʼ and the people in the temple is taken up again in verses 9 through 10. The specific mention of the nasiʼ going into the temple with the people and going out with them suggests some form of procession. Other references to the nasiʼ relate to the position of his land in the allocation among the tribes. Now, this you need to pay attention to. The first of these is concerned with the distribution of the land for the temple, the priests, and the Levites, and also the city, and the nasiʼ. So that's chapters 46, I believe. He actually has verses 1 through 5, 6, and verses 7 and 8, but he gives a number of chapters, so you have to look those up. But the nasiʼ, again, gets particular land, so that's the point here. Back to Biggs. There is no mention of the distribution to the tribes in this account. It is rather concerned with those institutions which relate to all the tribes. To that extent, the nasiʼ is seen in relation to the temple, along with the priests and Levites, but separated from the temple by the priests. This allocation of land appears to give geographical expression to the position of the nasiʼ. He is near the center of importance, but he is not the center of importance. That position, geographically, is taken by the temple. Next to the temple are the priests with the nasiʼ next to them. What may we conclude from this discussion? First, now catch these statements here. First, the position held by the nasiʼ is one of honor, as his place in the temple shows. He is the only one who may eat bread before Yahweh in the east gate and make his offerings in the gate. Also, he is given an area of land which is separate from the tribes. It is central and near the area set apart from the temple, priests, and Levites, and the city. Second, although not a priest or Levite, and therefore not permitted to offer sacrifice or serve in the temple, the nasiʼ has an important place in the functioning of the cult. He is to provide or to ensure that provision is made for the sacrifices. Third, as noted in the first point, the nasiʼ is given an area of land on either side of that set apart for the temple, priests, and Levites, and the city. Apart from the honor and importance which this confers on him, there are three important conclusions to be drawn. Biggs lists these out. 1, the nasiʼ is given independence. He has land for his support. I would ask here, and I'm going to break in here to Biggs, what does the Messiah need with support? Okay. He will not need, back to Biggs, he will not need to depend on taxes or other means of support from the temple or from the people. Number 2, the nasiʼ is forbidden to attempt to extend his land by taking that which is allotted to other tribes. He is also directed away from the pattern of earlier rulers who oppressed the people and pointed toward the promotion of justice and righteousness. Third, he is not permitted to dispose of his land allocation. It has to remain the possession of his family. Now, the reference to the family ought to be interesting. I would say this is back, sort of the way we summarize this. Here's the point to all of this. If you are literalizing the passage, okay, and again, my argument is going to be if you're reading Ezekiel 40 through 48 and you're insisting on literalism for the building, then you need to insist on literalism for the prince. And if you're identifying with him with the Messiah, with Jesus, you got some problems here. Here's why. If you're doing this, here are the problems. Number 1, why would Jesus be supervising a sacrificial system? That's the role of the nasiʼ. He doesn't do any of the rituals, but he's in charge of making it happen. Why would Jesus be doing that? Again, consider the problems of the absent furniture here, where do they wash, and of course the whole concept about bringing back sacrifices. Now you're putting Jesus in charge of a system that was rendered obsolete by what he did on the cross. Okay, it just seems like it's severely disconnected here. Number 2, here's your second problem. Since Messiah is also a high priest after the order of Melchizedek, it seems totally incoherent that parts of the cult and the temple complex would be off limits to him. But that's what you have. If the nasiʼ here is the returned Messiah, that's what you have. Again, just doesn't work. Third, does the returned Christ have a wife and children, physical descendants? After all, the nasiʼ is forbidden to get rid of his land. It has to stay within his family. So how does that work? 4, how is it that the king of all the earth, in the form of the returned Christ, has restrictions on what land he can hold? 5, how is it that the messianic king has no political tasks? How does a non-political Messiah rule the nations with the rod of iron? 6th and last, choosing to take the prince talk non-literally, but the temple talk literally is, to say the least, interpretively inconsistent. But if that's what you want to do, then that's what you're going to do. What I'm saying is, and what we've covered in this episode, is there are negative arguments against a literalistic approach, viewing what Ezekiel is describing here, viewing the fruition or the fulfillment of it as a temple that's in operation during the millennium. It's very, very problematic, both for those negative reasons, and also, if you're going to do that, then what about the prince? Are you going to take him literally too? Is this prince, again, a messianic figure, again, associated with David? Because after all, prince and king are interchangeable in other chapters in Ezekiel. It seems like we should do that. Well, if we do that, and if we press the literalism, we've got significant problems here. Again, things that just don't line up with the description of the return to Messiah. So, again, where does this leave us? I would say, if, on the other hand, you abstract the talk about the temple, again, you make it conceptual, symbolic, something like that. If you think about it abstractly, and in the temple's case, we get the benefit of having New Testament temple talk, which is where we're going to focus next week. But if you abstract the temple talk, if you abstract the prince talk, in other words, you get away from rigid literalism, then you can sort of make some sense of this, and you can kind of make it work with a Davidic ruler. Now, here's what Biggs does. And again, I don't know where Biggs is at theologically, but he argues for a Davidic ruler who isn't a king or a priest. So I'm just going to use this for illustration. Obviously, the returned Messiah is both a king and a priest. But here's what Biggs does with this. He says the emphasis here is on the nasi៍as a leader rather than a ruler. That is, there is an intentional distinction between the leader of the new community, whose significance is to be seen in relation to the temple, and the pre-exilic rulers whose significance was seen in their political activity, which led to compromises in the religious life of the people. Also, as a political figure, the king offered hope for the people because he was of the house of David and therefore heir to the promise of David. In the new community, that hope is to be found in the temple, in other words, not in a Messiah, which offers the people the way to Yahweh, who is the source of their peace and prosperity. The nasi៍is still a significant figure as he enables the temple to perform its function by ensuring the requirements for sacrifice and celebration are present. Okay, so end of quote. What Biggs is saying, and a lot of scholars are here with this, is that, look, by this time they'd given up on the Messiah idea. They'd given up on the monarchy, but the temple gave them hope. The temple, said to them that God, we can still worship God, we can still be acceptable to God. Again, it becomes very works-oriented, which, this is Judaism for its time period. And so what else can they do? What else can they do? And of course, Jesus, when he comes the first time around, challenges this whole notion. And I think, quite honestly, this is why when he, in the temple scene, when Jesus, chases out the money changers, he's like, look, destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll build it up. And the account is very clear that he's not referring to the structure. He's referring to himself. The body of Christ is the temple. In that conversation, the body of Christ is transformed or transforms the temple language. If you look at that, well, then you're going a whole different direction away from literalism. And frankly, the New Testament does go that direction. I find it extraordinarily difficult to defend a literal temple view. So, I think we need to start thinking on these terms. If we abstract these things, we can have this work because we allow the New Testament to tell us how to read this language. We're not tied up by bringing back the sacrifices. We're not tied up by explaining the inconsistencies and the disconnections of the temple description in Ezekiel just on their own terms. We went through the list of them here in this episode, and in relationship to descriptions of building the tabernacle and the first temple. We're not bound to worry about that and explain it if we let the New Testament temple talk essentially just take over at this point. We're also not bound and tied up and hemmed in and concerned with explaining, well, no, wait a minute. Okay, so in the millennium, we have the Messiah, but then he hires this other guy who's also a Davidic ruler, but he's not a king and he's not a priest either. He just supervises the sacrifices that come back. What? Okay. We don't have to worry about coming up with some way to make that picture coherent. You do have to worry about all that stuff if you press the literalism. So in part 2, next week, we're going to talk about really what I think is a better approach. I've already telegraphed that I'm on the non-literal side of this. I would refer to it as the transcendent side of this, the transcendent reality view, not just worrying about a building. And let me just give you a little preview of how we're going to approach this next week. There are positive arguments for taking the vision as more than literal, as transcending a building. Number one, Ezekiel 48, the rearrangement of the tribes. There's an issue there that is going to, again, suggest something. So I'll just leave it there. Number two, there are strong links in Ezekiel 40 through 48 to the Eden story and the cosmic mountain idea. Chapter 40, verse 2, very high mountain, Zion. Well, if you've actually ever been there, it's really not that high. It's not even the highest mountain in the area. But that language is cosmic mountain language. That means it's the most important mountain. It's the one that is the focus of God. Okay, it gets elevated, pun intended, to high status because it's His domain. Again, this is cosmic mountains talk. If you're familiar with unseen realm, you're familiar with the concept of the cosmic mountain. I'll throw in another one. In Ezekiel 47, the water and its effect. Taylor makes the comment that the land, and in particular, the barren wilderness of the Arava and the Dead Sea, are in view in Ezekiel 47, and they are transformed into an Edenic description. I think that's intentional. I think that speaks of something more than a building. Again, it's this transcendent idea. This is the restored Eden, and the restored Eden. If you peek, just take a peek. Go to Revelation 21 and 22. It says there was no temple. Okay, when the new Eden comes to earth, when we have a global Eden transformed, John point blank says when the city descends, okay, and that Zion, okay, on there, right there, on the mountain, the whole cosmic idea, the city descends. This is where God lives. It's the cosmic mountain thing. When that happens, there is no temple. I saw no temple there because you didn't need one because God was the source of light. Okay, so what I'm suggesting to you again is start thinking more abstractly, this sort of stuff. Third, there's the issue of New Testament temple talk. Again, we got into that a little bit, but we're going to return to that in some more detail later on. An interesting tidbit here, okay? And I'm going to go back to Greenberg here, and actually this isn't Greenberg, this is Bergsma, and maybe I will put this article in the folder when we do part 2. But catch this statement. This is from an article by Bergsma called "The Restored Temple as Rebuilt Jubilee." I'm sure some of your boats are already floating just at the title of that article, but listen to this. In this article, Bergsma says at one point, mention of the destruction of the city, Jerusalem. He's commenting on chapters 40 through 43 here. Mention of the destruction of the city, Jerusalem, in the opening date formula in Ezekiel 40, verse 1. That's the way this whole section begins. Presages the antithesis between the following vision, all this temple stuff, and the awful event it was meant to remedy. Was the date significant? We know of no event in the year 25 of the exile, 571 BC calculated, with which to connect this vision. But 25 years is half a jubilee, and the year of release is mentioned in Ezekiel 46:17. And the number, and its double, 50, and the multiples thereof, 100, 500, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, recur ahead in the measurements of the temple and the land. Okay, I'll stop there. Here's the question. Is that a coincidence? Or does it mean something? Is it designed to draw our attention to the Jubilee? And if it's designed to draw our attention abstractly to the concept of Jubilee, then what we have in Ezekiel 40 through 48 is a marriage of cosmic mountain stuff and Jubilee stuff. Could that be the point? Now, I'm going to suggest to you that makes good sense, but it's sure not literalism. And you know what? We need to get away from this notion that non-literal means not real. I would suggest to you when the Lord returns, and if the Jubilee thing is how we should read Ezekiel 40 through 48, it's still real. These are still real-time events. They're just described in symbolic language. Symbolic language does not mean what's being described will not happen. What's being described is not real. What's being described can be dismissed. No, that is a caricature of non-literal interpretive approach. It's a caricature, which is another way of saying it's bogus, okay? It's a straw man. So I hope that sort of gives you a little taste, a little foretaste of what we're going to get into next time. It's a very interesting possibility. Again, we're going to be dipping back into Bergsma, this whole Jubilee idea. Again, just taking an altogether different approach in part 2. And I'm telegraphing you up front that I'm in the non-literal camp here. I don't know that Bergsma's right or anybody else is right. I think the New Testament's right. Okay. I think the New Testament drives us in this direction, as well as the problems we talked about today. But I'm not going to claim to have everything nailed down. I just want you to consider a different approach next time in part 2.
Now, the temple is a big part of the Jewish eschatology. Could you touch on that a little bit?
I actually think that if, let's say they started building a temple tomorrow, I'm willing to bet my library. Okay. So, I'm pretty serious here. I'm willing to bet my library it won't match Ezekiel 40 through 48. In other words, if people start building a temple even now, because if that starts happening, you know what people are going to say? Oh, this is fulfillment of prophecy. Oh, we got the end times right upon us. And yeah, okay, let's just see what they actually build. And if it's not, if it doesn't conform to Ezekiel 40 through 48, you're going to have people somehow try to explain that again. Oh, well, this one has to be destroyed. Then we'll get the real millennial time. The whole question is just going to churn up again. It's just going to change directions a little bit. It'll become what it was. I think, in view of just Judaism, any serious Jew would love to see a temple. Okay, they would love to see this. Now, here's the question. In view of what we talked about today, let's say that the Jews have rebuilt their temple. There it is. Somehow they pulled this off without causing a third world war. Are they going to look at that as the fulfillment of prophecy? You say, well, what prophecy? You could say on one hand, well, they might look here at Ezekiel 40 through 48 and say, okay, we couldn't build one that big, and we put a roof on it. Okay? So it's not the same, but that's okay, because this is going to help us worship God. It's going to be, part of what we need to get back to. But you know what? To really have Israel restored, we do need a Davidic king. We do need all of the land. And of course, then they're going to have to fight about what the promised land really is, the boundaries of it. In other words, they could have a temple today, but do they have the other things? And who needs those other things to be satisfied that they're looking at some sort of act of God in a prophetic sense? You're going to have other Jews that say, hey, it doesn't matter. After all, Ezekiel 40 through 48, there's this prince guy. We're just going to hire some guy. It pays well. It has benefits. Okay, we're just going to hire some guy, and he'll supervise a new sacrificial system. And we're content to not, worry about, starting a war here, that the Messiah can win and settle. And we're just grateful to have a temple. This is good enough. I mean, you're going to have a whole spectrum of opinion on, is this prophetic fulfillment? Does this have anything to do at all with prophecy? Does it have something to do with prophecy and we're going to be content? Or is this like the first installment of other prophecies? You're not going to have unanimity in thought on any of this, even if you built one today. You're just not. The only way you're going to have tongues really wagging is building exactly what Ezekiel describes. But see, then what's still missing? What is missing? The Davidic ruler, even like a number 2 guy. That's not the Messiah, and he's not like this guy we talked about today in Ezekiel 40 through 48. Even if you hired that guy or found that guy, what authority does he really have? Is he just a figurehead? We don't have a theocracy still. We don't have a Davidic ruler. Are we supposed to get that, or have we given up on Messiah? Have we given up on the land, and we're satisfied now with just having this temple? Is that where we're at now, and that's where we're going to be? A lot of Jews would say, good enough, close enough, horseshoes and hand grenades, okay, good enough. But you're going to have others that say, no, it's not good enough. It's not good enough until it conforms exactly to Ezekiel 40 through 48, until we have every last square inch of the land God promised to us, and until we have a Davidic king ruling not only here, but we can read the last few chapters in Isaiah too. He's supposed to rule the world. That's good enough. People just don't get into the ramifications of what they're talking about when it comes to this sort of material.
And I'll admit, Mike, I've always believed in literalism for the temple, so I'm going to have to go and digest that. But what I do know, Mike, I can help people out here, is that the cosmic mountain is not Space Mountain at Walt Disney World. So if anybody was confusing the two, I just want to go ahead and
I'm sure glad you pointed that out.
help people out that might be confusing.
I rode that thing all the time. We used to go to Disney World when I was in junior high. We'd go late. We just keep getting on that thing.
There you go.
So see, the Lord was preparing me to talk about the cosmic mountain there when I was getting whipped around like an idiot. Well, we should jump in here. This will be, again, just like the last one. There's a lot of detail to cover here, so I don't know how long it'll take, but it'll just surprise listeners, I think, to go through this, because the natural tendency is to wonder, well, if we're not going to look at this literally, well, what is there to talk about? Well, there's a whole lot to talk about with respect to kind of interpretation. How we should read this description, these chapters, Ezekiel 40 through 48. Now, in part 1 of our treatment of this, in the last episode, we talked about, obviously, the question of how we're supposed to read it. Is it literal or something else? Are we supposed to see a future literal building in these chapters, a millennial temple that is in operation after the second coming of Christ? So we spent a good deal of time on that. We talked about the nasi៍, the prince, in these chapters. Again, points of connection or disconnection, depending on how you read these chapters with the Messiah. How would we read it messianically? Because if we discovered it, if you just read these passages, these chapters literally, again, this sort of rigid commitment to literalism, you have all kinds of problems. You have theological problems, you have interpretive problems in both respects here with the building idea, the structure idea, and then the prince. And so I let it be known in the last episode that I was predisposed to a non-literal understanding of the vision, not only for the negative reasons, which we talked about in the last part. That was one of my 3 reasons, but the other 2 were the way Ezekiel 38 and 39 gets repurposed in the New Testament. Again, I think that lends itself to a non-literal approach. And then I mentioned there were positive arguments for seeing the description as pointing to a reality that transcends a physical building. And that's really our subject matter for today. And in part 1, last time, I telegraphed that point, again, the positive ideas, just a little bit, I guess a little bit of a teaser at the end of part 1. Alongside the problems, again, created by a literal approach, there are hints in the text that a non-literal interpretation is not only appropriate, but really that's what was intended. In other words, that there would have been readers, who picked up on certain things. And the short list of the positive arguments for a non-literal approach that I gave were these, and these are in a little bit different order than I teased this episode with last time. But there's New Testament temple talk. Number 2, there are strong links to the Eden story and the cosmic mountain idea. Third, I mentioned that there's something going on in Ezekiel 48 with the rearrangement of the tribes that, again, sort of drives us to think non-literally. And then fourth, I mentioned an article by Bergsma, Restored Temple as Built Jubilee in Ezekiel 40 to 48. So I again let the cat out of the bag, at least that much, and I read a little section about the Bergsma article to sort of set this episode up. So what we're going to do this time is I'm going to walk through each of those 4 things in more detail for our time today. And I'm going to start with the first one because it's the easiest, it's sort of the most obvious, and that is New Testament temple talk. It's a very straightforward starting point, so that's where we're going to begin. I would say, as I hinted at last time, that the New Testament is pretty clear about its use of temple language in association with Jesus' body. And of course, Jesus' body is the place in which the glory of God, God himself, was because of the incarnation. Jesus was God incarnate. So it's sort of natural to look at Jesus' body when you come at it, again, with that thought in mind, with the incarnation in mind, of saying, well, sure, this is a temple. This is God's temple now. God isn't really dwelling. There's no Shekinah glory cloud in the temple that the Jews are going to every Sabbath there in Jerusalem, where there's nothing like that. The glory, departed, and it hasn't returned. There's this future expectation of the return of the glory. But the glory is right here. It's in this person, Jesus. And so the Gospel of John in particular picks up on this idea. So there's some clarity there with the temple being Jesus' body. And then, of course, since we are the body of Christ collectively as believers, we're also the temple. We talked a little bit about Paul's language, but I want to actually read some of the passages here. Just when I read these, just think about what the passages actually say, actually describe. So let's start with in John chapter 4, the one about Jesus' body, and starting in verse 18, John chapter 2. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. And the disciples only get clued in here, after the resurrection, because they're picking up on the 3 days thing. It's a foreign concept to them to have, a person, especially if they're living in Jerusalem. There is a physical structure there that is the temple. It would have been a foreign concept and a stretch to them to think, okay, there's this guy Jesus, and his body is now really the temple, because this one's going to be destroyed and the glory of God isn't there anymore. And then abstractly, we're going to be thinking of ourselves as the body of Jesus too. I mean, those are abstractions that they could only really process after the resurrection, and really even years after that, as they started to sort of put the threads together, put the points of the mosaic, the messianic mosaic is the term I use in Unseen Realm. This took a while after the fact for them to formulate this theology based on not only their experience with Jesus, but based on passages in the Old Testament and concepts, more importantly, concepts from the Old Testament that they saw played out in the life of Jesus, and that they could, again, conceptually weave together after the fact in their ministry, their post-resurrection ministry. So here in this passage, they're focused on the 3 days thing, and that's their immediate point of contact right after the resurrection. But we, looking at it, we have the letters of Paul, we have what Peter's going to say about believers being the temple and being indwelled the Spirit of God, the glory of God tabernacling in believers. We have all that language. So it's easier for us to see this idea of the temple being not only the body of Christ, and since we are the body of Christ, we also are the temple of God collectively, and even individually, our body is a temple. So I'm going to read some passages from Paul and some other places. It's not just Paul, it's Peter as well, that has this idea. So in 1 Peter 2:8, building on this Jesus body being the temple idea, let's go to 1 Peter 2:8, or 2:4, excuse me. We'll start there. And just listen to the text. Peter writes, let's go back to verse 1. All right, we get a little more of the context here. So put away all malice and all deceit and hypocrisy and envy and all slander. Like newborn infants, long for the pure spiritual milk, that by it you may grow up into salvation, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is good. As you come to him, a living stone, rejected by men, but in the sight of God, chosen and precious. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, now he's going to quote the Old Testament, "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So the honor is for you who believe, but for those who do not believe," quoting again another passage, "the stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, and," another passage, "a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense." Now, look at this language. This is from the Old Testament. "Behold, I am laying in Zion a stone." And Peter interprets that stone as being a person. Whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. So there you have an Old Testament backdrop that Peter sees after the fact that makes sense of the John chapter 2 the temple is Jesus' body kind of concept. And he applies it to believers here. He refers to believers as living stones. And those living stones, those believers, are being built up into a spiritual house. In other words, not a structure building, but a spiritual building, a spiritual house. Why? To be a holy priesthood. Well, that you need a priesthood if you're going to have a temple. What's a temple without priests? Again, and the priests are you and me, us, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Again, it's very clear that the temple language is being applied to both Jesus and us. You know, the portions, the parts of his body, okay, which is the church. So believers are the temple of God because we are the body of Christ, both individually and corporately. So let's take a look at a few other passages. Ephesians 2, verse 20 says this, that we are built, or the church. Well, let's just go back there because we want to pick up right before verse 20 here. Verse 18, for through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the holy ones, with the saints, and the members of the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone, in whom the whole structure, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord. In him you also are being built together into a dwelling place for God by the Spirit. I mean, you got half a dozen references there to building and structure and stones and again applied to being members of the household of God. Okay, we build on the apostles and prophets. Jesus is the cornerstone. We are, again, part of this structure being joined together into a holy temple. I mean, it's very transparent. Again, if this is easy to read over. And again, we have been conditioned, I think, within the evangelical orbit to I hate to put it this way, but to not see temple language in the New Testament. We have been conditioned to think only of this millennial thing. And it's very transparent here in Ephesians 2. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 3:16. This is one we mentioned last time. 1 Corinthians 3, verse 16, Paul again, just like in Ephesians, he's speaking to predominantly a Gentile audience. Again, they were strangers and pilgrims, but now they're not. And here we have in the Corinthians, with the Corinthians situation, he says, do you not know that you are God's temple? You are as a verb there, and it's plural. You are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells in you. Pronoun there, plural. Again, he's speaking to a church which is comprised of individuals, but and so the plural is being used, but of course they're a collective as well. If anyone, verse 17, if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is holy, and you are that temple. I mean, what could be clearer? 1 Corinthians 6, a few chapters later, Paul, again, basically talking about the same thing. He says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. Therefore, so glorify God in your body. And talking about sexual immorality here. So he is speaking to individuals, but again, there's still the plural language in the Greek text because the individuals are also a collective. It's two sides of the same coin. But again, the temple connection is very clear. Now, those are the ones that, I think, but in my experience, I've actually found a lot of Christians don't know, but I think, we should know those. But there are some other ones that are equally as transparent, but that are sort of missed, skipped over. Here's 2 Corinthians chapter 5. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Just listen to this. For we know that if the tent, what does that remind you of? The tabernacle, okay? For we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. Now, of course, he's speaking of individual's body, but when he speaks of the individual's body, he's using tabernacle and temple language, because he's already done that in 1 Corinthians. Okay, they get it. Verse 4, for while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened. Not that we would be unclothed, not that we should want to die, okay, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. Again, the indwelling of the Spirit. 2 Corinthians 6, the very next chapter, in verse 14, Paul says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement? Now look, in all those verses leading up to this point, he's talking about believers versus unbelievers. Okay, now he switches the language. He doesn't use the word believers, okay, or making it like about humans in human terminology. Verse 16, what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said. And now he's going to quote the Old Testament. He's going to quote Leviticus 26. I will make my dwelling among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you. And I will be a father to you, and you shall be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. So he quotes a Leviticus passage, and everybody living back in the days of Leviticus would have only been thinking of a structure as a temple. But Paul says that very same passage is justification for calling believers and calling this church and the church the temple. Again, the language is transparent. Let's go to 2 Peter 1, verses 13 and 14. Now, I'm going to read this, and what I'm looking for here is sort of hidden by the English text. It's obscured. But Peter says, I think it right, as long as I am in this body, to stir you up by way of reminder. Now, body here in Greek is the term skenoma. It's related to other terms like skenos or skenao. This is the term in Greek that is used to translate the term for tabernacle in the Old Testament. So a Greek hearer, someone who would have been, that would have been the language they're listening in, they could understand it, or their native language or whatever. Again, Hellenized Jews would have known Greek very well. They would have heard this, I think it right, as long as I am in this tabernacle. Again, as long as I'm tabernacling, in this body, to stir you up by way of reminder. Verse 14, since I know that the putting off of my body, same term there, skenoma, the putting off of my body, my tabernacle, will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ made clear to me. So there are things like this where, if you can kind of penetrate the English, will sort of stand out to you that they're thinking of their bodies in terms of being tabernacles and temples. Because why? Because the Spirit of God, the glory of God, is dwelling in them. Now, the question is, why would we look for a literal temple to come when 1 Corinthians 3:16, 1 Corinthians 6, Ephesians 2, 2 Corinthians 5, all these passages, when all these passages have believers individually and corporately as the temple of God? Now, if we suppose the people of Ezekiel's day couldn't imagine a temple without the literal trappings of that terminology, maybe it's equally true that perhaps they couldn't have imagined the temple being indwelt people. Again, typically the appeal to literalism here is, well, people who would have read, the Israelites who have read this would have expected, literal structure. Okay, well, that's fair. Of course, we've already seen that there are certain Old Testament passages that the apostles apply, temple passages, tabernacle passages that apply to individual believers. Okay, the apostles make that connection under inspiration. So it's really not an issue of what an Israelite would have expected necessarily, as under inspiration, people saying, well, this is how this passage sort of worked its way out. And with all this temple language in the New Testament applied to either Jesus, his body, or us as the body of Christ, why should we expect a building to come back? Why should we expect that? Why would we need to revert to purifying sacred space, to having sacred space in the form of a structure? And again, just check back with last episode. In Ezekiel's temple description, there are different objects of furniture that are pretty important that are missing in the description. Why would we need to revert to a physical structure as sacred space when we are already sacred space? Why would we revert, again, to doing sacrificial rituals to purify a piece of ground that is occupied by a literal structure so that we could be in the presence of God when the presence of God is already in us? Okay, we are told to go boldly to the throne of grace for precisely that reason. We don't need to go to a building and be purified to occupy, to stand on sacred space. We have access now because we are members of Christ's body, who is the temple. That's why we're the temple. We're the temple because he's the temple, and we are in Christ. Again, the thinking about this with a literal expectation is a theological reversion, okay, to something that has already in the New Testament pages been superseded. Again, we need to give credence to that. I mean, these are New Testament writers applying these passages and this language in this way. And frankly, I don't think that we can assume very cavalierly that we should dismiss it. Now, that's the easy place to talk about this. Okay, that's the most familiar. I want to go to Numbers 2 and 3 in my list. I'm going to combine these because number 3 is really part of number 2. But the second and third reasons, again, that I gravitate toward a non-literal approach would be there are links to the cosmic mountain idea in Ezekiel 40 through 48. And then third, there's this thing about the rearrangement of the tribes in Ezekiel 48. That's actually sort of a subset of cosmic mountain thinking. And for those who are new to the podcast, again, it's a little hard to get you up to speed in one episode. I'd say go read Unseen Realm, and you'll find out in the first third of the book, what we're talking about with cosmic mountain stuff. But in a nutshell here, the phrase cosmic mountain is an academic one that refers to God's dwelling place. And, this is important, and the place where he held counsel. That is the place from which God runs the cosmos, where he issues decrees that affect the destiny of humanity, and where he tasks his human imagers and believers, his human imagers, with their role in God's program. Now, I dealt with that a lot in Unseen Realm. You can go back and read that. There are other features to it, but I think I'm hoping this will be sufficient for the sake of this episode. It's an idea that we have seen elsewhere in Ezekiel. Again, the cosmic mountain theme has cropped up prior to chapters 40 through 48. And one of those I'm going to sort of build off on here is that the place where God lives, of course, in Ezekiel's day, which would have been the temple in Jerusalem, that was the cosmic mountain then, Mount Zion and the temple. That place was viewed in Ezekiel in one or two places as the center of the earth. Okay, the center of the earth. I should say incidentally here, and pardon me for the rabbit trail, but this is another quandary for flat earthers. Okay, Jerusalem, just get out a flat earth map and you're going to see this. Jerusalem is not the geographical center of the flat earth by any measure. Okay, so this isn't language that we want to take literally, uber literalism again, literal, just this unthinking, robotic, literalistic approach. This is conceptual language, this idea that the cosmic mountain, wherever it is the center of the earth. The reason it's thought of as the center of the earth is because this is where all the decisions are made by God and his council to run the show. Okay, this is where everything happens. Everything is oriented to and by this place. Now, with that in mind, let's look back at Ezekiel 38, verses 11 and 12. We're going to be seeing a few things here going up into the chapters 40 through 48, but I want to reacquaint you with a couple of the statements that we've already seen in Ezekiel. Ezekiel 38, 11 and 12, these are words that were put in Gog's mouth, again, in this revelation. We read here, God tells Ezekiel, say, I will go up, or basically, again, it's related through Ezekiel, but this is what Gog is thinking, again, in context. I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will fall upon the quiet people who dwell securely, all of them dwelling without walls and having no bars or gates. Verse 12, to seize spoil and carry off plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places that are now inhabited, and the people who were gathered from the nations, who have acquired livestock and goods, and here's the key phrase, who dwell at the center of the earth. Okay, so we know Ezekiel 38 and 39 is an invasion of Jerusalem, Israel, okay? And this is referred to as the center, Hebrew there is tabor, the center of the earth. Again, it's not literal geographical thing. This is a concept. And by saying it's symbolic or metaphorical or conceptual, it doesn't mean it's not real. This is where, again, the dwelling place of God was, where the presence of God was, and this is where God runs the show. This is part of biblical theology. Ezekiel 5:5 says this, thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set her in the center of the nations, with countries all around her. So this notion that, again, Israel, of all the nations in the world, Jerusalem is at the center of all that. Well, again, geographically, if you're going to actually do measurements, that's not going to work literally. It's a concept. Okay, it's conceptual. Now let's take this and go to Ezekiel 40 through 48. I'm going to quote here an article that I put in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers, so you can read this whole article. It's by Levinson, called The Temple and the World. It's very good. And he comments on both of these passages that we just read, and then he's going to get into Ezekiel 40 through 48. Here's what he says. The word translated in the midst of, betok, again, Ezekiel 5:5, I have set her, in the center, in the midst of the nations, betok, of the nations, can have either a general significance, inside or amidst, or a precise one, in the very center of. As in Numbers 35:5, where the city stands in the mathematical center of the Levitical patrimony. The rearrangement of the tribal lands in Ezekiel 48 argues for the latter interpretation, this idea of being the very center, very center of. For there Jerusalem, renamed Yahweh is there. If you go to Ezekiel 48, that's what Jerusalem is called. Yahweh is there. Jerusalem there, Yahweh is there, is put almost in the center of the tribes, whereas historically 11 tribes were to its north and only one to the south. In other words, the utopia in the school of Ezekiel seems to take literally the assertion of centrality in Ezekiel 5:5. If they were correct in their literal reading, then the translation navel of the earth for the very rare word tabor in Ezekiel 38:12 is most likely. Again, this total center. In Josephus, we find the cosmic conception of the temple in an enhanced statement, not simply that the shrine is the center, but that it is a microcosm. Josephus tells us regarding the Mosaic tabernacle, quote, every one of these objects is intended to recall and represent the universe, as the reader will find if he will, but consent to examine them without prejudice and with understanding. End of quote. End of Josephus and end of Levinson. What Levinson's saying here is that the rearrangement of the tribes at the end of Ezekiel 48 suggests that the writer is thinking of Jerusalem as the cosmic center of everything, the cosmic center of the world, the cosmic mountain. Because this is what the cosmic mountain was in biblical theology. It is the place that is at the center of the universe, of all existence, of everything. And again, you can't literalize this and have it make any sense. Again, and I'm not just talking to the flat earthers here. I'm talking to, those who would want to literalize these chapters. You can't literalize this. And since you can't literalize it, that suggests to the reader that we've got something conceptual going on, that we should read Ezekiel 40 through 48 conceptually, again, metaphorically, symbolically. There's something going on here other than just rigid literalism. Now, take that and let's keep thinking about these chapters. There's language in Ezekiel 40 through 48 that apparently casts the temple in cosmic mountain terms in other ways. If we go to Ezekiel 43, verses 13 through 17, it's a reference to the altar that is in this envisioned temple. Now the ESV, I'll just go to Ezekiel 43:13 again. This is really obscured in English translations. The Hebrew matters here. We have a reference here let's take verse 14. We have a reference to the altar being from the base on the ground. Okay, a description of the altar, the base on the ground. The Hebrew there is mechek haaretz. It literally is the bosom of the earth. Now, in Levinson's quote, he talked about how tabor could be translated, the navel of the earth. Again, these were ideas of total centrality. Okay, total centrality. The altar is referred to as the bosom of the earth in this passage. Now, recall, you say, well, where's he getting this idea? Recall, one of the items in Solomon's temple that wasn't in the tabernacle, that possibly indicates that the earlier temple, Solomon's temple, not just the one being envisioned by Ezekiel now after Solomon's temple was destroyed, but Solomon's temple itself, there are things in that description that show us that the temple was conceived of as the cosmic mountain, the very center of everything, center of the universe idea. The copper sea, or the molten sea, or the bronze sea, English translations do render it differently. The Yam Mutzach, okay, that is part of the temple description of the Temple of Solomon. Okay, it was this big bronze, thing that held lots of water. It was said to have stood in the courtyard of Solomon's temple. It's described in 1 Kings 7:23 through 26, and in the parallel account in 2 Chronicles 4, verses 2 through 5. Now, I want to quote from Carol Myers here in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. She says this: just as spectacular as its size, was its ornamentation. She's talking about this copper sea, the bronze sea, the molten sea, its ornamentation. Under its rim was a series of cast decorations, 2 rows of gourds. Okay, again, it's Edenic imagery. It's garden imagery. 2 rows of gourds. The rim itself was made of lily work. Most amazing of all was the way it was supported on 4 sets of bronze oxen, with 3 oxen in each set. Each set of oxen faced a direction of the compass, with their hinder parts facing inward and supporting the basin. Unquote. Now, this orientation, the oxen, the orientation, they're each group of 3 is pointing to a different cardinal point on the compass. Okay. This orientation led W.F. Albright to suppose, sort of a la Ezekiel 1 with the cherubim faces. Again, I've commented many times, including this podcast, about how each of the faces was a cardinal point of the zodiac, and that's why they're looking where they're looking. Albright took this description of the molten sea and its oxen as also referring to the cardinal points of the zodiac. Again, 3 groups, different cardinal directions of the compass here, signifying in his mind, again, this is what he argued in some of his work, he believed that this arrangement signified the temple was the center of the universe to the Israelite, that's why it was designed this way. And the garden imagery linked it to Eden, which was the first cosmic mountain in biblical theology. Now, 2 Chronicles 4:5 notes that the molten sea had 3,000 baths of water. That's a lot of water, okay? Myers notes this. He says, the cultic purpose of this elaborate item among the courtyard appurtenances of the temple is not specified. In other words, if you go to 2 Chronicles 4:5, it never tells you what they're supposed to do with the water. She continues, its use as a laver, in other words, for ritual washing, is dubious. Why? Since 10 bronze lavers, as large and spectacular in design, are also part of the courtyard furnishings. In other words, that's where people were supposed, the priests were supposed to wash. The molten sea, this huge cast metal thing with the oxen, the 3 groups of 4 pointing in the cardinal directions, it's never said that they're supposed to wash in that. Whereas in the lavers, that's where they do their washing. So, why even have it? Myers writes this, again, just continuing with her in Anchor Bible Dictionary. She says, one of the features of ancient Near Eastern temples was their utilization of artistic and architectural elements relating to the idea of the temple as the cosmic center of the world. The great deep, or cosmic waters, remember we're talking about the molten sea, 3,000 baths of water here. The great deep, or cosmic waters, is one aspect of the array of cosmic attributes of such a holy spot. The temple of Marduk at Babylon, for example, had an artificial sea, Ta'amtu, in its precincts. And some Babylonian temples had an Apsu, a sea, a large basin, to commemorate, again, this idea. Such features symbolize the idea of the ordering of the universe by the conquest of chaos. Now, let me just break in there. Remember in Genesis 1, the chaos has to be brought into submission, has to be brought into order, has to be subdued. Genesis 1, 2, that the waters were calm, the Spirit of God hovering over the waters. It's this idea of God has to bring the chaotic stuff into order and make this world fit for human habitation. It's this battle against chaos forces to bring them under control so that humans can live in this place. Okay, the temple, she's saying, symbolized that victory, symbolized that same idea that the waters of chaos were now under control, and this was the center of the world. And back to Myers here, she says, such features symbolize the idea of the ordering of the universe by the conquest of chaos, or they represent the presence of the waters of life at the holy center. Ancient Israel shared in this notion of watery chaos being subdued by Yahweh and the temple being built on the cosmic waters. Remember what the first temple was? Okay, the first temple was Eden. Okay, Eden is built on the earth that emerges out of the waters in Genesis 1. Okay, it's the same idea. Back to Myers, the great molten sea near the temple's entrance would have signified Yahweh's power and presence, end of quote. In other words, his control over everything. This is the cosmic center. Now, Levinson, again, picks up on sort of the same idea as Myers, back to his article. And in verse 15 in Ezekiel 43, there's a fascinating term. Again, this gets obscured as well in English. So we have the reference to the base on the ground, again, the bosom of the earth of this altar. And then in verse 15, we have, and this I'm reading the ESV, and the altar hearth, was 4 cubits. Okay, altar hearth, this is going to be mind-blowing, I think, for some. In Hebrew, it's the term ha-har-el, literally the mountain of El, the mountain of God. Ha-har-el. And Levinson notes here the term, just take the definite article off, the term har-el, mountain of God, in the same passage, again here in Ezekiel 43, is to be connected with Akkadian aralu, a term for the netherworld, about which the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary remarks that it was a cosmic locality opposite of heaven. In other words, this is the counterpart, this location where the ha-har-el is situated. The altar hearth, the altar that's the bosom of the earth in Ezekiel 43, is the earthly counterpart to heaven, okay, to the cosmic dwelling of God, all right? It's back to Levinson here, the cosmic locality opposite of heaven. Now, Levinson throws in this comment, we should note, though, as does Albright, that the ancient Israelites may have understood this term as mountain of God. In other words, not as this netherworld, this oppositional point. But then he says that's a concept no less cosmic anyway, unquote. So, yeah, I agree. I mean, this is how the altar of this temple is referred to: the bosom of the earth and the ha-har-el. Again, these terms are loaded with theological cosmic significance. Levinson goes on in his article to quote from another article by Moshe Weinfeld, and I think that article was in Modern Hebrew. I don't have this article, but getting the citation, I think this is the case. But Weinfeld examined the creation story of Genesis 2. I'm just going to summarize it to the description. He compares the creation story of Genesis 2 to the description of the building of the tabernacle in Exodus 39 and 40. You say, well, why would he even think of doing that? Well, here's how Levinson summarizes Weinfeld's study. And for those of you who have read John Walton's book, The Lost World of Genesis 1, where Walton argues, and I think he argues it well, in my view, that the creation account is really about Yahweh's construction of the heavens and earth as a cosmic temple building project. Okay, this is going to sound really familiar. Walton is building on something Weinfeld, was tracking on. So Levinson summarizes, what's going on here this way. I'm quoting Levinson now. Weinfeld's thesis is that the priesthood in Israel actualized by means of the Sabbath the completion of the acts of creation, in the same way that the peoples of the ancient Near East actualized in their cultic dramas the primordial event. Whereas in the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, the construction of the temple of Marduk, called Esagila, crowns and consummates creation, the Sabbath does the same in Israel. Thus, we should not be surprised to find that the texts describing the creation of the world and those describing the construction of a shrine are parallel. I'll just break in here. Weinfeld has a bunch of parallels in his article, and so does Levinson, between the two accounts, both in vocabulary and phrases. Again, if you get Levinson's account or his article, if you're a newsletter subscriber, you'll see a little table in the article about these parallels. But anyway, he's saying we shouldn't be surprised there's parallels between Genesis 2 and the building of the tabernacle. Back to Levinson, he says, the temple and the world stand in an intimate and intrinsic connection. The two projects cannot ultimately be distinguished or disengaged. Each recounts how God brought about an environment in which he can find rest. According to Exodus 20:11, he rested on the seventh day. Psalm 132:8 calls on him to rise from his rest, menucha, identified as the Ark of the Covenant in verse 6, and the tabernacle in verse 7. The Sabbath and the sanctuary represent the same moment in the divine life, one of exaltation and regal repose, a moment free of anxiety. 1 Kings 6:38b tells us that it took Solomon 7 years to build his temple. A coincidental number, right? 7 years to build his temple. According to 1 Kings 8, he dedicated it during the Feast of Booths, which occurs in the 7th month, and which in Deuteronomic tradition is a festival of 7 days. Moreover, the speech in which Solomon dedicates his shrine, just completed, is structured around 7 petitions, 1 Kings 8:31 through 55. Levinson asks, can the significance of the number 7 be coincidence, going back to the creation week? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. His answer is no, it's not coincidence. It's not coincidence. There, again, just to summarize this particular point, there are connections between the way the altar and the temple are talked about in Ezekiel 40 through 48 that have distinct, important links to the cosmic mountain motif, the cosmic mountain concept of the rest of the Hebrew Bible. And again, I would ask with Levinson, is that coincidence? No, I don't think so. But if you're reading these chapters with only a literal structure in mind, and you're not tracking on the wider metaphor of the cosmic mountain and the symbology of these elements, you are going to miss all of that. You're going to miss all of it. And when it comes to the New Testament, think about what we've, where we've been to this point in the episode. Let's apply New Testament temple talk to what we just read about, the molten sea and the bosom of the earth, and the Ha-Har El and all this Akkadian stuff, the idea that the temple, was focused on the center of the earth, the cosmic center, and there's a parallel between the creation story and the building of the tabernacle so that Yahweh rests at the end, 7-year periods, all this. Let's take all of that and now marry it to New Testament temple talk, where we began our episode. I just wrote out a few points. Just think about this. The body of Christ is the temple. We are his body, in whom dwells the glory Spirit of God. Our rest is in Christ, period. He is our Sabbath rest. Second point, we are therefore the current cosmic mountain, the already cosmic mountain, the place on earth where God dwells and through which he runs his program, which of course is the restoration of Eden. And of course, the integral point to that is the gospel. Third, the future, the The not, we're worthy already, but the not yet, the future cosmic mountain is the New Jerusalem, in which there is no temple. Revelation 21, verse 22 says that explicitly. There's no temple. Why is there no temple? Because it's been replaced by the Lord Almighty and the Lamb returned to earth. Well, the Lamb of God, Jesus, who is the temple, back in John and other passages. Fourth, this New Jerusalem is also the new Zion, the cosmic mountain made Edenic, and is the center of the global Eden. Fifth, if Old Testament temple talk points to the temple being the cosmic center, what the New Testament describes, doing so in far more than literal terms, points to precisely the same idea. We are already the cosmic mountain. We are the temple. We are the central thing. Okay, the body of Christ is the central thing through which God works out his decrees, his plan for humanity, and that is to restore Eden. We are the agents of that program. So we are the already cosmic center, awaiting the not yet cosmic center, the return of Jesus, who is the temple, and the ushering in, again, of the New Jerusalem in a global Eden. All of these ideas should be familiar to this audience. They all dovetail here. I'm hoping you're seeing how things just sort of come full circle. And there are parts of Ezekiel 40 through 48 that draw on the same set of ideas. Okay, temple language is not just about pass me the brick and mortar. There's so much more to it than a physical construction of a physical structure. An Israelite would have looked at the temple in very abstract, conceptually significant ways. And what we're suggesting here is that Ezekiel 40 through 48 brings, again, these concepts with it, brings it along. And so it's a misreading of Ezekiel 40 through 48 to only think of a physical structure. Now, we're at our fourth point. And again, this one I think is going to be quite new to people, but it's really neat. I don't know how else to say it. It's just really cool. And this is Bergsma. I'm going to refer to Bergsma's article here, The Restored Temple as Built Jubilee, in Ezekiel 40 through 48. I've also put this article in the protected folder for newsletter subscribers so you can read it. It's fascinating. Now, let's just start off here by talking about Jubilee. And I have Harper's Bible Dictionary open. It has just a little couple of sentences here on Jubilee that I think are good for us to hear as we go into this. Jubilee refers to the 50th year occurring at the end of 7 sabbatical cycles of 7 years each, in which all land was returned to its ancestral owners and all Israelite slaves were freed. The Jubilee is described in Leviticus 25, 8 through 17, verses 23 through 55, and Leviticus 27, 16 through 25, and also Numbers 36, 4. It was proclaimed with the blowing of the shofar, a trumpet made from a ram's horn, on the Day of Atonement. The Hebrew for Jubilee is Yovel, and it takes its name from the ram's horn. Okay, that's the end of the entry. Anchor Bible Dictionary, one sentence here, different article on the same thing, says, the year of Jubilee came at the end of the cycle of 7 sabbatical years. Leviticus 25, 8 through 10 specifies it as the 50th year. And I'm going to read Leviticus 25, 8 through 10. You shall count 7 weeks of years, 7 times 7 years, so that the time of the 7 weeks of years shall give you 49 years. Then you shall sound the loud trumpet on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the Day of Atonement you shall sound the trumpet throughout all your land, and you shall consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee, that is the 50th year, shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to his property, and each of you shall return to his clan. Now, with that as a backdrop, let's go into Bergsma a little bit. Bergsma writes this up front here. He says, the purpose of this paper is to pick up and develop a suggestion originally made by Walter Zimmerli, one of the greatest modern commentators on Ezekiel, that the dimensions of the restored temple envisioned by the prophet in Ezekiel 40 through 48 were focused around the number 50, and that the number 50 symbolized the Israelite institution of the Jubilee, the year of liberation, which was to be celebrated every 50 years. My intention in what follows is to develop the argument that Ezekiel builds his temple on Jubilee dimensions, and to explore the theological implications of such a proposal for the understanding of Ezekiel's vision of restoration in chapters 40 through 48, end of quote. So that's what Bergsma's trying to do in the article, and it's fascinating. He starts off with the very first verse of Ezekiel 40 through 48. That's Ezekiel 40, verse 1. So let's just go to Ezekiel 40, verse 1. And this, of course, is going to be the date. I'll read the verse. In the 25th year of our exile, at the beginning of the year, on the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after the city was struck down, on that very day, the hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me to the city. Okay, that's the first verse. Now, in part one, I read something to set up the temple as Jubilee idea. I actually, in part one, I actually gave you the wrong source. I thought it was Bergsma, but it's actually Greenberg, an article by a guy named Greenberg on page 190. And we've corrected the transcript. I'm going to read it again about Ezekiel 40, verse 1. And Greenberg said this. Mention of the destruction of the city, in this verse, Jerusalem, in the opening date formula, presages the antithesis between the following vision and the awful event it was meant to remedy. Was the date significant? We know of no event in the year 25 of the exile, which calculates to 571 BC, with which to connect this vision. But 25 years is half a jubilee, and the year of release is mentioned in Ezekiel 46:17. And the number and its double, 50, and multiples thereof, multiples of 50, such as 100, 500, 5,000, 10,000, 25,000, recur ahead in the measurements of the temple and the land. Unquote. Now that's an understatement. Recur ahead. I'm actually going to give you the stats on how many times these multiples occur. But before we get there, again, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here. Given the fact that no significant event in biblical history is associated with the city that corresponds to the date given in Ezekiel 40, verse 1, Bergsma says this. The phrase, the 25th year of our exile, begs to be interpreted symbolically, but 25 is neither a common nor symbolic number in the Hebrew Bible. The best, and perhaps only suggestion for its significance has been as half of a Jubilee cycle of 50 years. Now that's page 76. I'll skip a little bit. He continues. If this indeed is the symbolic significance of Ezekiel's chronological marker, it accords well with the interpretation of the return from exile as a Jubilee event, also found, for example, in Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 4. That's the passage that Jesus quotes in the synagogue in Nazareth. Back to Bergsma, the identification of 25 years as half a Jubilee is strengthened by the phrase, now catch this, quote, at the beginning of the year on the 10th day of the month, unquote. Bergsma says, the only other passage in the Hebrew Bible which indicates that the year began on the 10th day of the month is Leviticus 25, 9 and 10, in which the Jubilee year, and I would argue, Bergsma says, the cultic agricultural year in general, began in the 7th month, which was Tishri, on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. Let me read that again. He says the only other passage in the Hebrew Bible which indicates that the year began on the 10th day of the month is Leviticus 25, 9 to 10, in which the Jubilee began in the 7th month, Tishri, on the 10th day of the month, the Day of Atonement. Continuing with Bergsma, why the year would begin on the 10th day of the month has been the occasion for some discussion. But there is reason to think that the first 9 or 10 days of Tishri were a New Year's festival and considered liminal time, neither the old year nor the new year, kind of this in-between period. The new year began in earnest only at the end of the festival, on the Day of Atonement. Thus, Ezekiel seems to be following the old ecclesiastical calendar represented in the holiness code of Leviticus, in which the cultic year begins on the 10th of Tishri. And here's his sentence, the sentence I want you to catch. He says, only the association with the Jubilee year text, Leviticus 25, 8 through 10, makes meaningful sense of both the figure of 25 years and the beginning of the year on the 10th day of the month, here in Ezekiel 40, verse 1. This is the only thing it can correspond to. He adds in a footnote that the 10th day of the month was also the start of the watch of the Passover lamb. That's Exodus 12, verse 3. Now, his source for the New Year's festival thing, liminal time, is Jonathan Safran, Jubilee and the Day of Atonement. And it's in a book I don't have, the Proceedings of the 12th World Congress of Jewish Studies, published in 1999. If you ever find that, buy it, because it's really hard to find. I don't have access to it. But I just have to stop here and tie this already. We're just barely into this, to Jesus, whose body is the temple and the king of the final cosmic mountain. Do you see the implications of what Bergsma has just noted? He's arguing that the date in Ezekiel 40, verse 1, deliberately takes the reader's or the hearer's ear back to the beginning of the Jubilee cycle, specifically the 7th month, Tishri. These are the only two passages in the Hebrew Bible to use the phrase at the beginning of the year and the 10th day of the month, which was Tishri 10. In terms of the relationship of the Jubilee year and the Day of Atonement, a New Year celebration would precede the Day of Atonement, and the Jubilee year began actually on Tishri 1. Let me rephrase that a little bit. The reference to the 10th day of the month is Tishri 10. But if it's correct that Tishri 1, and we know that this is correct because of the ecclesiastical calendar in the Hebrew Bible, the year actually began on Tishri 1, then they would have this celebration. And then after Tishri 10, we'd have the Day of Atonement, and that was like the ecclesiastical beginning of the year, because the Day of Atonement was the reset for everybody. You hit the reset button. Everybody's in right relationship to Yahweh. So Tishri 1 actually begins, the calendar year, but then Tishri 10, at the end of Tishri 10 is when you have the Day of Atonement, and then you get the Jubilee year beginning then. Look at all those things that are together. Day of Atonement, New Year's, Tishri 1. Where have we seen Tishri 1 before? Okay, on this podcast, it's the birth date of Jesus. Okay, September 11th, 3 BC, Tishri 1. Tishri 1 was the ceremonial date as well for the inauguration of a new king. The birth of Jesus, of course, signaled an end to the exile and the coming atonement. Why else would he come? Jesus was the Passover lamb. Remember the note here that Bergsma had, that all this in the 10th day of the 7th month, on this calendar, again, associated with the Jubilee, that was also when they began to start looking for the Passover lamb. And of course, Jesus is the new temple. We're the new temple because we're united to him, having become members of his body. Could it be that the temple description, by virtue of this date in Ezekiel 40, verse 1, and the cosmic mountain imagery found elsewhere in the chapters, could it be that Ezekiel 40 through 48 foreshadows all of that? It foreshadows, by virtue of its association with Tishri and the Jubilee, it foreshadows the coming of a new king on Tishri 1, who would bring atonement, who was the Passover lamb. You say, Mike, that's just kind of bizarre. That's just reading a lot into Ezekiel 40 through 48. Is it? Because all of these ideas would have been floating around in the head of an Israelite. All of them. The only thing that's missing is the actual person who would play the role of the Passover lamb, who would play the role of the new king, who would be the temple, the place where the presence of God dwelled. That's the only thing that's missing. The idea of a person, a man who was actually God incarnate, in whom the fullness of the Godhead, the glory of the temple dwelled. That is the only missing element to all of this. That's the thing that they lacked. It's the thing that the Israelite readers of Ezekiel 40 through 48 lacked. They have everything else. They have the association with Jubilee. They have the association with Tishri Tishri 1 and Tishri 10, and the Day of Atonement and the Passover Lamb. They have every blasted piece of it if you read Ezekiel 40 through 48 abstractly like this. The only thing missing is the person who brings all of the threads together. And I'm telling you, the Tishri 1 birth date of Jesus of Nazareth would have been a big deal. Anybody who knew that, who did the math, who fit that together, who knew about the narrative, with the Magi. We don't know how many people knew this. I mean, John, again, gives us this information in Revelation 12, again, reading that as astral prophecy. We don't know, who had all these threads and put them together, but John did. John did. And the New Testament did. The only thing missing to the Israelite is who does this? Where do the threads all meet? That was the mystery. And again, where I'm going with this, I mean, it was deliberate. Okay, you're not supposed to know this until after the fact. Because had the rulers of this world known, what was going on, they would never have killed him. Okay, it's all part of the same matrix of ideas. Now let's go back to the temple vision. We are not done. Okay, we've made, Bergsma is tracking on this Jubilee idea, and the number 25, half a Jubilee, and the number 50, the Jubilee, is important. Get a load of this. Scholars have noted the numbers and dimensions of the temple are consistently multiples of 25 and 50. So half a Jubilee and a Jubilee. These are just the stats. This is like more than 3 or 4 times. The number 25 shows up 8 times in chapters 40 through 48. The number 50 shows up 10 times. The number 100 shows up 13 times. The number 250 is 4 times. The number 500 is 8 times. The number 1,000 is 4 times. The number 5,000 is 2 times. The number 10,000 is 7 times. And 25,000 is 14 times. You have 60 references to Jubilee numbers and their multiples in Ezekiel 40 through 48. Now, again, to echo Levinson, is that coincidence? Further, the number 500 is 10 Jubilees. Scholars have noted that here in Ezekiel, you have 10 times 50, 10 Jubilee cycles. And of course, in Leviticus, going back to Leviticus, the same collective cycle of Jubilees occurs as well in Daniel 9, but in there the number 49 is used. 49 times 10, the weeks of Daniel 9, all that stuff, 490 years. The concept of 10 Jubilees is present in both books. They're just using different numbers, 50 and 49 respectively. The concept of 10 Jubilee cycles is also present in 1st Enoch and 11Q Melchizedek. I've mentioned 11Q Melchizedek before. This, both of those texts, and we'll get into a little bit more when we get to our episodes on Melchizedek, but both of those texts, those books, of course, 11Q Melchizedek is just a manuscript. Okay, they have the 10th Jubilee marking the end of exile. 11Q Melchizedek specifically associates the end of the exile with Isaiah 61. It actually quotes Isaiah 61, the release of captivity, the same passage Jesus quotes of himself at Nazareth. 11Q Melchizedek also associates the one who marked the Jubilee cycle with the Elohim figure of Psalm 82, verse 1. There's something going on here in the Jewish mind about these Jubilee cycles. And if we're taking the New Testament at face value, it all converges in a person. And that person is Jesus of Nazareth, who is the temple, according to the Gospel of John. And, some of the other passages we read too. Now, Bergsma, just one more quote from him, and then we're going to wrap up. Bergsma adds this: even the total area of the holy city does not depart from being a multiple of 50. At first, this is not obvious, since the dimensions of the city walls are given as being 4,500 cubits on a side, Ezekiel 48:16. The number 4,500 is indeed a multiple of 50, but not a very attractive one. The more obvious candidate would be 5,000, Jubilee of 50 times 100. However, when one is careful to include the common pasture land, which extends 250 cubits, around the city on all sides, that's Ezekiel 48:17, one finds that the prophetic author has indeed allowed 5,000 cubits on a side for the entire holy city including pasturage, as Ezekiel 48:15 makes clear. Admittedly, Bergsma continues on another page, it is not possible to prove that the Jubilee was the inspiration for these dimensions. I would suggest, however, that the likelihood for such being the case is enhanced when we recognize that the Jubilee dimensions of the temple fit into a larger pattern of allusions or references to the Jubilee throughout the book of Ezekiel, though space prohibits careful analysis of all the texts. Ezekiel 7:12 through 13, Ezekiel 11:14 and 15, Ezekiel 18:8, 13 and 17, Ezekiel 22:12, and Ezekiel 34:4 all contain language that seems to be taken from the Jubilee legislation of Leviticus 25, providing some corroborative evidence that the prophetic author is very familiar with this text. I would say, yeah, he is. He is. And again, 60 references to Jubilee numbers and their multiples. 60 in these 8 chapters. Is that coincidental? I would say, based on the theology that's packed into the connection back to the Jubilee, I don't think it's coincidental. I think this is foreshadowing. I think it's intelligent, again, prophetic rhetoric going on here. Now, they don't have all the answers. Again, what they're missing is the person in which all of these threads converges. We know who that was, and we know from the New Testament how the birth and the life and the death and the resurrection and the ascension of Christ dovetail with Jubilee language. And again, he is the temple. So I would say this to conclude. If one reads Ezekiel 40 through 48 in a way that A, transcends literalism, and B, gives credence to the way Ezekiel repurposes cosmic mountain ideas and the Jubilee of Leviticus 25, then you get fascinating conceptual and theological connections between the temple vision and Jesus, whose body was the temple, and his birth date, and the atonement, and believers as members of that body. I just don't think this is coincidental. I think it's authorial foreshadowing. And in terms of the New Testament writers, it's insight into that foreshadowing after the fact of the crucifixion, the resurrection, the ascension. And given the problems with the literal view, again, if we go back to part one of this, given the problems the literal view creates for theology and for interpretation just generally, I personally have little doubt that the non-literal approach is better and frankly contributes more to the matrix of biblical theology across the Testaments.
I've said it once, I'll say it again, Mike. We need to find a way to jumpstart Jubilee.
Well, it's all ready, but not yet.
There you go. Hey, also, I want to go back to part one. Any thoughts on who the actual prince is?
Well, I would kind of agree. You know, it's really interesting because if you go back to part one, there was part of Biggs's article. You know, he tries to abstract this, you know, so that there's still a messianic connection, but yet he's not a priest. Okay, he's making what the priesthood does possible. If you look at that description and you say, okay, there is some Davidic connection here, the only way that you can sort of get to Jesus, I think, with some success is to merge this figure again with the priest, and we have that in Jesus. I mean, it's not perfect again because you have sort of an apolitical Jesus, but again, I could say, I'll just say this: if you place all of that language in the context of the atonement, that's the already part, but the return of Christ and then the New Jerusalem at the end of days, you know, a la Revelation 21 and 22, the global Eden and all that stuff. Everything is his anyway. In other words, you don't need a political system to keep things in line. It's already by definition in line. And the political system actually, you know, is sort of, you know, a crude because of his presence again, and we're part of that because we're his body and we're over the nations and all that sort of thing. I think you can take all of this information and merge them into Christ through different routes. I would never say that you can get that, or an Israelite could get that without knowledge of who the Messiah was, and the whole talk about the nations and all that stuff. You have to bring a number of threads together to get there. But I think you could, again, very abstractly. So the reason I mention that is the Jewish expectation. I think this is part of why they expected sort of two figures, not just one. I mean, there are places where Jewish expectation is two messiahs, or a messianic figure from a different tribe, other than David, Joseph and stuff like this. I think they were trying to see how a descendant of David who wasn't a priest but had some relationship to a priesthood, how this could all fit. And so they were postulating more than one figure, whereas again, by virtue of the New Testament and its use of things like the Melchizedek priesthood and Psalm 110 and the whole idea of the atonement and, again, recovering the nations, if you're reading these things through that lens, you can get there, again, by virtue of abstracting the concepts. So, is it Jesus? Is it not Jesus? I think a better argument is to be made that, yeah, this is still Jesus, but you can't get there with a literal reading of Ezekiel 40 through 48. You can get there with a conceptual, symbolic, abstract reading of that passage, and then bringing other passages in to explain the language of those 8 chapters. So that's the way I would approach it. It's not a simple yes or no answer. To me it's a yes with very specific qualifications. But I can say this with confidence: you cannot get to Jesus with a literal reading for the Prince. You just can't do it. There are too many disconnects.